Welcome to Looking Through Luke, our journey together, our exploration of one of the biographies of Jesus, written by a man named Luke, written that those who believe and those who are curious about who Jesus is might be certain of the truth of Luke's claims and of the truth of Jesus. Today, we pick up a really interesting passage. We've been following Jesus' ministry as he's begun. And I want to tell you a story, and I apologize in advance. It's a terrible, terrible story. I just couldn't think of a better one. When I was younger, much younger, around about the age of 11 or 12, I had a cassette tape player. And this was back in the days when you could record onto your cassette things that were being played on the radio. And there was a footy show on the radio, Aussie Rules radio show, every Saturday morning called Could Have Been Champions. And a part of that segment of the show every week was a guy would write a song. It was actually very, very clever. He'd write a song, something football related each week. And I, over weeks and weeks and weeks, had recorded these songs. Yes, I recognise now it's illegal, but I was 11. And I carefully edited them onto the cassette to come up with this tape of footy songs. One of my closest mates was a die-hard footy lover, played footy, bagged for the Bombers, was all things footy. And I thought this would be an incredible gift for him. And I was really enjoying this recording stuff. Anyway, I'd spent ages. I had about 40 minutes. The tape was full, many songs. And just before I was to give it to him, I hadn't let him know, but I thought I'll just listen through and admire my work. And as I was doing that, in the middle of these songs, the voice of my younger brother appeared through some of these songs at indiscriminate moments. And he would be singing, and I apologize for this, I'm gonna eat my poo, baby. Yep, my younger brother was singing about eating feces on this carefully prepared cassette tape. Naturally, as an 11-year-old, I was pretty horrified. He was pretty pleased with himself. It didn't end well. The reason I tell you that story, you go, well, why, James, has this got to do anything with Jesus and the Bible? And that's a very good question. The reason I tell you this story is because we get to a part of Jesus' ministry today where he engages with the religious leaders about a day that was called the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath was a gift from God. It was a day of the weeks, the seventh day, where you rested. Having worked for 6 days, laboured in the fields, you got to the seventh day and you got to enjoy good rest. God established this rhythm of work and rest because he knows that we need rest. Our bodies need rest, our souls need rest, our minds need rest. And so this was the gift of this rhythm of life. But by the time we get to Jesus' day, this good gift had been distorted. Much like my cassette tape, which was a great gift full of all these great footy songs, it was marred beyond recognition because of my brother singing about eating feces. The Pharisees had taken God's good gift, this gift of rest, and they'd saddled it, they'd laden upon it all of these rules and these requirements and prescriptions around the day that actually had distorted the gift and marred it beyond recognition. So with that in mind, as we think about that, I want us to read the passage that we're up to from Luke chapter 6. I'm reading from verse 1. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick up some heads of grain rub them in their hands and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions." Then Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." On another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand in front of everyone." So he got up and he stood there. Then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or do evil, to save life or to destroy it?" He looked around at them all, and then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was completely restored. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do with Jesus. So our reading focuses on 2 Sabbaths. And in the first of these, Jesus claims to be the Lord of the Sabbath. And in the second, he demonstrates his authority, the authority that he is the Lord of the Sabbath through healing the man with a withered right hand. So Jesus and his mates are walking through, they're eating the grain, and around the corner comes the Pharisees. Some of us have grown up thinking that, religion and religious people are buzzkills. Well, if you ever wanted to look for a place where that might be true, look at the Pharisees. And they turn up, and immediately they're on to Jesus and the disciples who are having a good time eating some grain. And what do they say? They say, "Why are you doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath? Why are you a lawbreaker? Why are you a rule breaker?" Now, the real issue here isn't really the why or the what, but the when. Right? They're doing it on the Sabbath. So it's not unlawful to pick grain through a neighbour's field as you walk through. In fact, there's actually provision in the Jewish law just for that. The question is, why are you doing it on the Sabbath? That's what the problem is, the Pharisees are saying. We know from Exodus that God directed the people work 6 days, rest a 7th. But by Jesus' day, as I said earlier, the religious leaders had saddled this gift of rest with so many laws and regulations. In fact, there were 39 types of work, types of activity that you could not do on the Sabbath, according to the Mishnah, which was a Jewish document that said what was lawful and what wasn't. And in this document, some of the activities listed included reaping and threshing and winnowing and preparing food. You couldn't do that, according to the Pharisees, the religious leaders, on the Sabbath. And so they see the disciples, and immediately they assume, hang on a second, we've got a code red quadruple violation here. They're breaking rules left, right, and centre. Why? Well, because they were picking the grain. And surely if you're picking the grain, that's the same as reaping. And they were rubbing it through their hands. Surely that's the same as threshing. And they were blowing the husks away as they walked and talked. That's winnowing right there. And then finally, of course, they're eating the grain. Clearly, they've prepared food. That's ridiculous, isn't it? But you can see, the Pharisees were very earnest about this. You can see what they've done, how they've gone and they've distorted what God intended, how they've taken what God gave for this day to rest, which is a gift, a day to delight and be free, and they've made it an incredible burden. So what was meant to be for people's benefit, to bring lightness, to bring rest to minds and souls and bodies, has instead become a great weight. The joy and the life in the principle of this day of rest, of the Sabbath, has been completely sucked out And all that's left now, as the Pharisees are issuing their code red quadruple violation, is this lifeless religion. And to be honest, it's not too difficult to observe that in churches today. Maybe you've experienced it. Maybe you used to go to church and you don't anymore because this was your experience. We're not immune from this. The Pharisees, you see, they're so intent on proving their piety and the fact that they're made of the right stuff, that they're religious and morally upright. They're so intent on proving that they neglect to actually love their neighbour. We can easily distort God's gift. Churches, church members, church leaders, we have a tendency, don't we, to multiply lists of rules, and we want to know who's in, we want to know who's out, and we feel like we have to prove our own piety, justify our own righteousness, our own good standing and good name. And far too easily we can find ourselves loving our traditions and our practices more than we love our neighbour, more than we love the people around us. No wonder so many people today think of the church as being unloving. Well, Jesus actually steps forward on behalf of the disciples and he wants to rescue this gift. He answers them, and this is a little confusing for us. He answers them, have you never ever read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what was lawful only for priests to eat, and he gave it to his companions. And then Jesus said, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And what's interesting is Jesus takes an incident from the Jewish scriptures, from a book called 1 Samuel, in chapter 21, a story where we're told that David, who became Israel's greatest king, is running for his life. He's fleeing King Saul, who's trying to take his life. And while he's on the run, he enters into the tabernacle, the holy dwelling place of God, and there's a place where there's some bread. And that bread was called the shewbread, or the bread of the presence. It was in the holiest part of the tabernacle. In fact, it was a place that only the priests could enter. It was part of, and this bread was part of worship. It was part of worship on the Sabbath. You weren't allowed to eat it. And of course, Jesus says, well, David ate it. And he wasn't condemned for it. And though his companions weren't condemned for it. And God never actually said there was anything wrong with what David did. And the immediate kind of inference that Jesus is making to the Pharisees, well, is if David's boys can do it, well, so too can Jesus's boys. That these rules and regulations must not get in the way of life, of having our physical needs met. What does this mean for us? It all hinges on Jesus' statement. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Well, what was the Sabbath? The Sabbath was God's gift to people, God's provision in recognition that in life we need rest. That a balanced, healthy, flourishing life requires work and rest, a rhythm, if you will. And Jesus, he points at the Sabbath and he says, see this day that's meant to be a part of this rhythm of renewal and rest? Well, actually, says Jesus, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. I'm the one that can give you the really deep rest, the soul rest, the rest you and I most desperately need. In fact, when Jesus says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, what he's saying to you and I is, I am the Lord of rest. I'm the Lord of rest. We know how precious rest is, particularly as we live our busy, hurried and harried lives. We have those moments of reprieve, those moments of, Well, Jesus says actually you'll find the true source of delight and joy in this principle of rest when you place me at the center of it. So Jesus is trying to rescue this gift that God's given and the delight and joy that's found in resting well as part of living, working, and resting this rhythm. And Jesus says he has the authority to do it. Then he demonstrates it in verse 6 in the healing of a man with a withered hand. We read the story, didn't we? Jesus is in the temple and there's a man with a withered right hand. Jesus pulls him up the front and he knows what the Pharisees are on about. And Jesus is like, what's the Sabbath about? Doing good, doing evil. Which is lawful? To save life, destroy it. And he looks around. You can just imagine Jesus eyeballing people. And then he says to the man, stretch out your hand. As someone who actually grew up with a withered right hand, that's an incredibly emotive thing for me to read. Why? Well, because I can well imagine being that man in the synagogue. And for Jesus to call me down the front would have been a terrifying experience. It would be the height of cruelty, actually, to draw attention to a withered hand unless you can do something about it, unless you've got authority to do something about it. And Jesus does. Jesus heals him. And what Jesus is saying is to deal with that shriveled hand, to bring healing, is exactly what the Sabbath is all about. But because the Pharisees are so concerned about following the rules and regulations, they don't want to see the man with the shriveled hand healed. Can you imagine that? They're so concerned about keeping the rules, they want to risk, they don't want to see a man with a withered hand receive healing, the gift of a new hand. Spiritually speaking, they miss the forest for the trees, don't they? You could say their hearts are as withered or as shriveled as the man's hand. And what Jesus is saying is my kind of Sabbath is the kind where people can enjoy grain and corn and withered hands are healed. But your kind of Sabbath, Pharisees, is where people go hungry and stay sick. And as a result, the Pharisees are furious. And Jesus didn't come away to do away with the Sabbath. He came to dig it out from under the mountains of legalistic regulations and prescriptions, to give it again as a blessing rather than a burden. That this day was meant to be a day for showing mercy, a day of doing good. It's a day to experience delight and joy. But because Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, we'll only experience this delight and joy and rest when he becomes our one true rest. And friends, as I finish up, that's where we need to stop. Is Jesus your rest? Are you rested? Truly, in the deep depths of your heart and mind and soul, do you know rest? Because Jesus' invitation is to you and I to receive rest. He is the Lord of rest. He is the one who brings delight and joy and unburdens us from the anxieties of this world. And he invites us to discover that in him. Thanks so much for joining with me. Can't wait to see you again next time. Bye.